Well, good evening, everyone, and I do hope you're sitting comfortably, perhaps with a little restorative dram by your side. So on this dark eve of All Hallows, welcome to an evening of Sinister stories. For many years, I was a ghost tour guide, conducting unwary visitors on tours of Scottish castles, of Linlithgow and Edinburgh, dressed in my old teacher's gown with a black top hat and a skull's head on a walking pole. In Edinburgh, I worked for Mercat Tours, the first and foremost Edinburgh ghost tour company, set up and operated by historians. I was often asked, especially by Americans, why Scotland has so many ghosts. I could only explain that Scottish history was so full of incredible deaths that it was not surprising that such happenings occasioned many witnessed apparitions, with the spectres falling into one of three categories. Firstly, when the onlooker is able to see a split in the fabric of time, like these genuine photographs, and you witness an event which took place many years before, often on the anniversary of the occurrence of the death. Secondly, there are personality residues, when someone with such dynamic character and charisma in life lives on after death, their vital energy unextinguished. And thirdly, there are unrequited souls, people who died in such a manner that you cannot, but you will imagine tonight. You certainly will. My Edinburgh tours all began at the Mercat Cross, where to this day historic events take place, occasions like the recent declaration of our new monarch, King Charles III. It was also the place where, on the night before the Battle of Flodden, a ghostly herald read out the names of those who would die the next day, 10,000 Scots. In the past, it was also the place of public punishment, and here the most frightful acts were carried out. Scottish history is full of them, full of dreadful deeds. Take, for example, the most unfortunate ruling family in Europe, the Stuart monarchs. King James II killed when a cannon exploded and blew off his leg. James III murdered by a false priest during the Battle of Sochieburn. James IV butchered at Flodden, his headless body ripped apart. James V gave up the will to live, having been defeated by an English army, and his daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, well, she didn't fare too well either, did she? And then there was King James I. He was stabbed to death while trapped in a tunnel in the Blackfriars Priory in Perth. He was trying to escape through to the Royal Tennis Court when he came across a blocked drain. Somebody's talking. A blocked drain. One that he had ordered to be blocked as his tennis balls kept going into it. He was trapped and slaughtered by a group of conspirators led by his uncle Walter, Earl of Atholl. He had been told by a group of witches that he was the rightful King of Scots, and of course was the inspiration for Shakespeare's Scottish play. One brave, devoted servant, Catherine Douglas, attempted to keep the assassins out by putting her arm through the staples of the door. This gave the king time to make his escape at the cost of her limb, the bones of which were crushed and shattered. And it was all in vain, as the murderers still completed their ghastly regicide. The ringleader, Atholl, was caught while hiding out in Methven Castle and afterwards subjected to the most gruesome punishment at the Mercat Cross. Fastened by a rope to his ankles, hoisted to the top of a tall crane, and then dropped towards the ground, stopping suddenly and dislocating many of his joints. He spent an agonizing night in the Tolbooth jail, and then the next day he was capped with a red-hot iron crown and dragged behind a horse along the high street and back to the Mercat Cross, where he was disemboweled before being decapitated. Can such a soul as his be at rest, dying in such a manner? A headless body is occasionally seen hanging around the spot where the Mercat Cross used to be, a short distance from where the present one is situated. Popular suspicion is that it is the Earl of Atholl, back where his immortal soul left his shattered body. Another to meet his horrific end in the centre of Edinburgh High Street was James Graham, Marquis of Montrose, arrested after the Battle of Carbisdale, where he fought against the forces of Oliver Cromwell. He was dragged through the town before being hanged, the rope knotted at the front. He lasted 3 hours before being cut down, still alive, and beheaded. His head was placed on a spike on the Edinburgh toll booth and his limbs distributed to other Scottish boroughs. His torso was buried near the Boroughmuir Loch at the east end of the modern meadows. However, Montrose had the last laugh, for on the return of the Stuart King, Charles II, 10 years later, it was ordered that the Marquis's body parts should be collected together from where supporters had taken them. His head was even recovered, still mouldering on its spike, and even his heart was found, lovingly embalmed by faithful followers. Reunited, he was buried in St. Giles beneath a simple tomb. But dismembered as he is and hastily reassembled, can he really be at rest? His skeletal body has been seen by many, including Queen Victoria, who in 1886 ordered that a much grander tomb be built over the body to honour the royalist supporter. In the centre here is the receipt for the expenses incurred in tracking down and collecting all of Montrose's bits. And bottom right, another for trumpeters playing at the taking down of his head. Montrose seems to have foretold his fate in a poem he wrote before his arrest. Let me die midst a bloody lake, then place my parboiled head upon a stake. Scatter my ashes, strew them in the air. Lord, since thou knowest where my items are, I'm hopeful thou'lt recover all my dust, and confident thou'lt raise me with the just. Before we leave this area, let's stop for a moment at the heart of Midlothian. The stones indicating the site of the city's toll booth, the centre of Midlothian life, and a grim prison in which so many of our victims tonight were kept, including among them William Burke, led out at 8 a.m. on the morning of January 28, 1829, to be hanged for the murder of those poor souls he had delivered to the city's surgeons for the purposes of anatomical research. He received his just deserts, for after his death, his body was publicly dissected and parts of his skin sold off to make into a wallet, business card holders, and the binding of a book on human anatomy, now kept along with his skeleton in the College of Surgeons Museum. But back to the heart. For hundreds of years, it was a custom that passers-by would spit on the door of the toll booth to show their contempt for the inmates, or perhaps for the authorities who locked them up. And this tradition has continued. Many who indulge in the practice have no idea why they are doing it, while some believe that, like throwing a coin into the Trevi Fountain in Rome, the spitting ensures that they will return to Edinburgh one day. Proceeding up the high street, let's venture down one of the many closes that line the old town. This is Fisher's Close, named, as many are, after its 18th century owner, Thomas Fisher, a prominent city merchant. Several families rented properties down the close from him, living in close proximity to each other, and all discarding their rubbish and toilet effluvia from their tall tenement windows, so that it ran down the close into the Cowgate, a filthy street along which locals drove their cattle out to pasture. You took your life, or at least your health, into your hands walking down Fisher's Close, for at any moment the lower wooden shutters of a window would be thrown open and a chamber pot would empty its stinking contents. The poorer was meant to shout "Gardez-lou," "Prenez garde à l'eau," beware of the water, and warned early enough, the walker could shout back, "Haud your hand," but only too often the cry from above came too late, and the walker became the recipient of the disgusting contents. 18th century Edinburgh stank to high heaven, the smell colloquially called the floors o' Edinburgh. The stench from human effluvia, animal dung, midden heaps, and the smoke from hundreds of chimneys gave Edinburgh the nickname of Auld Reekie. But it was here in Fisher's Close that one of the most famous photographs of an Edinburgh ghost was captured on camera, a fair-haired woman dressed in white, a victim perhaps of one of the many diseases which swept through the overcrowded, squalid town, further spread by the fact that everyone drank water from 17th century communal wells, which were fed by porous wooden pipes through which the filth of the city trickled. I had my own encounter going down Fisher's Close. With a group of Americans, we came across one of Edinburgh's many homeless characters, reeking of drink, sprawled in a doorway. I instructed my group to quickly step over his protruding legs, and we continued with the tour. When I returned to the area to collect my car, the close was swarming with paramedics and police. On inquiring, I was told that the dead body of a homeless alcoholic had been found. I expressed my sympathies without telling the constable that earlier that evening I had walked over the corpse, and so had 25 American tourists. The high street from this point on becomes the Lawn Market, a place where linen was once sold. At the top is a row of houses called the West Bow, and in one of them in the 17th century lived Major Thomas Weir, a one-time officer in the Covenanting Army, and later the captain of the Edinburgh City Guard. A godly man, he was a regular at church, regarded by many as a saint, much respected and bowed to as he patrolled the city with his official ceremonial rod in hand. He shared his abode with his sister, Grizzle, and together they hosted fanatical prayer meetings. A few citizens were less sure of the man, including one young lady who reported seeing the good major abusing a sheep in a field by Arthur's Seat. She complained to her minister, who cross-examined Weir, but nothing could be proven. The girl was humiliated, accused of sorcery and demonic slander, stripped and whipped along the high street. It was Weir himself who spilled the beans. One Sunday he stood up in the St. Giles pulpit, and everyone expected the usual long, earnest prayer. Instead, Weir shocked everyone when he admitted to a catalogue of evils, including bestiality, incest, and witchcraft. He admitted that he was a follower of the Lord of Darkness, that he regularly held satanic covens where he inspected the witches present to discover their secret devil marks. Weir was taken to trial, where Sister Grizzle furnished the court with even more shocking details, including the fact that her brother's staff was actually his warlock's wand, which he had used to gain power over his female victims, that he was indeed the Wizard of the West Bow. Weir himself agreed, declaring, "I have lived as a beast, I must die as a beast." He was sentenced to be strangled and then, while still alive, to be burned at the stake. As he was incinerated, his staff was thrown into the pyre, where it leapt in the air and danced about before disappearing in an explosion. Sister Grizzle met the same fate, her last words being, "I intend to die with all the shame I can muster." Beside the bonfire, she proceeded to strip off, making lewd gestures to the crowd before being consumed by the flames. The house in which the Weirs had lived was, not surprisingly, hard to let. Edinburgh folk reported weird sightings and noises coming from the empty building. On several occasions, a black cloaked creature was seen at the window, and most were in no doubt that it was the devil himself, looking for his servants. Eventually, a Sergeant William Patillo and his wife agreed to live in the house, saying that no warlock frightened them. On their first night, the couple were awakened by a noise in the room, and opening their eyes, a dreadful apparition appeared before them, its flesh red raw and charred, and in its hand a blackened, scorched staff. They fled, and the house was never lived in again, eventually being partly demolished, with some of it incorporated into a Quaker meeting house. a place where gatherings are still regularly interrupted by paranormal activity. The Lawn Market merges into Castle Hill, leading, of course, to the centuries-old fortalice that is Edinburgh Castle. There has been a defensive fort here since the Iron Age, when it was called Dun Eden, the origin of the name Edinburgh. As can be imagined, the castle's long and bloody history has resulted in many reports of paranormal sightings. Stories abound of residents, for it is still an army barracks, and visitors, experiencing weird feelings, feeling deadly chills, being touched, the feeling of being watched, for example, by an old man in a leather apron, or a headless drummer boy, or a grey lady. She's thought to be Janet Douglas, Lady of Glamis, convicted of trying to poison King James V through the use of witchcraft. As was the law at the time, this accusation was enough to have Janet Douglas examined and pricked with a sharp bodkin to look for a spot that felt no pain, the devil's mark. It was reported that she had no reflection in a mirror and kept a black cat as her familiar. Her nose was broken and 13 drops of blood, the devil's number, came out. She confessed under torture with the Pillikins that she had indeed slept with the devil, and so was duly burned at the stake on the castle esplanade in front of her young son. The plaque shown top right commemorates the 1,500 women who were killed in Scotland in the same way. Janet Douglas died in 1537, but more recent is the tale of the Phantom Piper. In the 18th century, a secret network of tunnels was discovered leading from the castle. To find out where they led, the castle governor sent a young piper to search. The lad set about playing his pipes, and the people above followed the sound, which was clear for a time until it stopped abruptly. Search parties were sent down to locate the boy, but the poor piper was nowhere to be found. Disturbed by the boy's disappearance, the city council ordered that the entrance to the tunnels be blocked, and since his disappearance, bagpipes can still be heard emanating from beneath the Royal Mile. Coming back down from the castle on the north side is the Deacon Brodie Tavern, once the home of William Brodie, a skilled cabinet maker, trade deacon for his craft, and an Edinburgh town councillor. He came from a well-to-do family and on his father's death inherited considerable wealth, but Brodie was a gambler, a womanizer and a cockfighter. That is, he bred fighting cocks and bet on the outcomes of bloody battles as rival fowls tried to eviscerate each other. In order to raise the finances to feed his addictions and keep a wife and family and 2 mistresses and 5 illegitimate children, I wonder if Boris Johnson is listening, Brodie decided to supplement his income by robbing his neighbours' houses. He made copies of keys that he was given so that he could work in a house and use them at night to enter and steal. He took on board 3 partners, an expert locksmith and 2 ex-cons, and together, during 1786 and 1787, they robbed many Edinburgh premises. At council meetings, Brodie would express shock and disgust at the spate of robberies, and he suggested a reward of £150 for any information leading to an arrest. The temptation was too much for one of Brodie's accomplices, John Brown. He was already unhappy at the share of the takings he was receiving. Brodie heard the news that Brown had gone to the authorities, and he tried to flee from the city. A reward was issued for his capture. That man, that respectable citizen by day and burglar by night, the inspiration for Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Brodie was eventually arrested and lodged in the toll booth. The trial caused a sensation. Brodie was unsuccessfully defended by the Dean of the Faculty of Lawyers, Henry Erskine, and found guilty by a unanimous jury, sentenced to death by hanging on a newly constructed gallows which had a built-in trapdoor, all designed and built by, you've guessed it, William Brodie. He is seen here depicted in his toll booth cell and also being played by Billy Connolly in a 1997 BBC production. And so on the morning of October the 1st, 1788, Brodie mounted the scaffold, chirpily, breezily, waving and chatting to those he knew in the vast crowd. He seemed unafraid because he had a plan. He had left strict instructions for his body to be put into the care of Mr. Alexander Patterson, one of Edinburgh's most eminent surgeons. With a massive groan from the crowd, the trapdoor opened and Brodie fell, but not very far, according to some onlookers, and rumours abounded that Brodie had bribed the hangman to set up only a short fall. He was cut down, pronounced dead by Alexander Patterson. The body was loaded onto a cart and quickly taken away, reputedly to remove a silver tube which Brodie had swallowed into his throat. Deacon Brodie was supposedly buried in the family mausoleum in Buccleuch churchyard. When the area was sold in 1963, the gravestones were moved to allow for construction on the site. An archaeological team was given permission to open up some of the tombs, including that of Charles Darwin's uncle and Andrew Duncan, Professor of Medicine and President of the Edinburgh College of Physicians. In the Brodie tomb, 2 skeletons were found, but they were of men much older than Deacon William Brodie. He had died just aged 47. There was no sign of his remains. So did he survive? Was he resuscitated? Where did he go then? How does his spirit rest, knowing that the burial place reserved for him is not his final resting place? His dual personality certainly lives on through the creation of Robert Louis Stevenson, the book written in the year 1888, exactly a century after Brodie's hanging, but maybe not his death. On our way to the Buccleuch graveyard, we passed another burial ground just off George IV Bridge, a street so named in honour of the royal visitor who came to the capital in 1822, the first British monarch to do so in 170 years. The visit was meticulously planned by Sir Walter Scott, who suggested to the king it would be an excellent gesture if he wore the kilt. This was now legal after having been banned following the 45 Jacobite rebellion. King George IV was over 24 stone, so a kilt manufacturer had to be found who could create a large enough garment. George, Hunter and Co. of Princes Street volunteered to create a whole Highland outfit, including sporran, dirk, sword and pistol, for the cost of £1,350, the equivalent of about £135,000 today. Because no one had made a kilt for so many years, and because of the monarch's size, the garment rode much higher up the royal knees than had been intended. Quickly, a pair of flesh-coloured tights was created, and a grand Highland ball was arranged, kilt attire only to be worn. So there was a mad scramble across Scotland for those invited to acquire the appropriate tartan attire. The ball took place in Parliament Hall, and beforehand King George mounted a podium to address a crowd of onlookers. It is recorded that one elderly Edinburgh lady expressed the view that she had been delighted to see so much of her king. As I said earlier, just off George IV Bridge is another cemetery, one attached to the Greyfriars Church, which began life as a monastery of Franciscans until it was destroyed at the Reformation. In 1563, Mary Queen of Scots granted land at Greyfriars as a burial ground to replace the overcrowded kirkyard of St Giles, where John Knox, the Protestant reformer, is buried under what is now parking space 23, a spot used every day by a female barrister as a protest against the man who complained about the monstrous regiment of women. Around the 16th century kirk of the Greyfriars lie some of Scotland's most famous individuals, including Joseph Black, known for his discoveries of magnesium, carbon dioxide, and latent heat. He was Professor of Anatomy and Medicine at the University of Edinburgh. But many tour groups focus on these headstones, said to have influenced the writing of J.K. Rowling. You can see there Riddles and Moody's and Potters and McGonagall's. Other Harry Potter-related memorials are said to have provided the names for characters like Rufus Scrimgeour and Crookshanks the cat. In addition, the entire kirkyard is rumoured to have been the inspiration behind the resting place of Harry's parents, the eerie and beautiful graveyard in Godric's Hollow. And just over the wall, surely, those are the towers of Hogwarts, in actual fact, Heriot's School, where Rowling's children were students. So much for JKR's fictitious supernatural happenings. Greyfriars Churchyard has some real unexplained goings-on. In the centre is the tomb of the brutal George Mackenzie, nicknamed Bloody Mackenzie, on account of the number of Presbyterian Covenanters he had killed, and the thousands he had imprisoned in a walled-off area of Greyfriars Kirkyard. At his death in 1691, he was interred in this imposing mausoleum, but a series of events in the early 21st century seemed to have awakened him from his eternal slumber. The first was when a homeless man broke into the tomb on a dark, stormy night. No sooner had he laid down when the earth gave way, and the unfortunate down-and-out found himself lying on top of Mackenzie's lead coffin, which promptly buckled. The next day, an employee of an Edinburgh ghost tour company entered the tomb and took photographs of Mackenzie's mummified head, visible through a hole in his casket. The final straw was when this lad, Sonny Devlin, and another 15-year-old broke in and descended to the lower chamber, where they severed Bloody Mackenzie's head with a penknife and started to play football with it. They were arrested and charged with violating the sepulchre. At the High Court, the judge, Lord Wheatley, summed up the gruesome and revolting offence, stating that the 17-year-old had pushed his hand into the mummified head's neck and talked to it like a glove puppet. The boys were duly sentenced to probation, but they had unleashed Mackenzie's spirit, and now anyone walking in the graveyard of an evening is liable to be bitten, scratched, kicked or pushed. Some have reported feeling sick or freezing cold, or even receiving burn marks on their skin. You enter at your own risk. Before we leave Greyfriars, have a look at these objects. They are, of course, mort safes, which in the early 19th century were placed over recent burials to deter the grave robbers, those unscrupulous men who at dead of night exhumed the recently buried body and sold it to the anatomists, who would use the corpses to teach their students about the human body. The case is well documented of a grave robbery in Greyfriars in the year 1818. Two resurrectionists opened up a recent unprotected burial and found inside the coffin the body of a young woman, Marjorie McCall. They noticed she was wearing an expensive ring on one finger, and one of the robbers tried unsuccessfully to pull it off. A knife was produced, and they proceeded to cut through finger, flesh, and bone. Ah! With a scream, the corpse sat bolt upright, obviously awakened with the pain out of a death-like coma. The robbers beat a hasty retreat. Marjorie was rescued and lived for several additional years until a final burial. Double-checked, I hope. Not far from here, another woman cheated death. This was Maggie Dixon, found guilty of killing her newborn baby and duly hanged at a public execution in Edinburgh's Grassmarket in September 1721. The deed was hastily performed as the crowd was getting restless, and soon relatives were fighting with medical students for possession of the body. The relatives won. Maggie was placed in a coffin and transported to Musselburgh for burial. En route, the party stopped at an inn and, leaving the coffin outside, went in for some light refreshment. Suddenly, the door of the pub burst open, and a terrified passerby informed the group that he thought he had heard a noise coming from inside the casket. With trepidation, the relatives brought the coffin inside, and after much discussion, eventually decided to prise open the lid. There the shrouded body lay, eyes still closed, jaws held firm with a binding. She seemed dead, but her eyes shot open, and she uttered a hoarse, guttural noise. This contemporary etching shows the shock she gave to her burial party. Later, when everyone recovered, half Hingit Maggie, as she was then called, and her companions walked back to Musselburgh. As the sentence of the court had been carried out, Maggie was beyond further prosecution, and she lived for another 40 years. Her story is remembered in the name of Grassmarket pubs, The Last Drop, and Maggie Dixon's. The middle picture shows the spot where the gallows was erected. At least Maggie was discovered before she was buried, for being buried alive was not uncommon until fairly modern times. An exhumation of several Victorian graveyards has revealed disturbing signs of scratch marks under coffin lids. Without modern electrocardiograms or electroencephalograms, 19th century medics resorted to a variety of methods to test for life before they pronounced death. Tobacco smoke enemas were commonly employed, where smoke was blown through a pipe into the rectum to see if the corpse reacted. Other methods involved the use of smelling salts containing burnt deer horn. Patents were taken out for emergency release coffins or caskets with a rope attached to a bell above the burial. With those cheery thoughts in our heads, let's return to Edinburgh High Street. We are here at the City Chambers. The current edifice was originally built as the Royal Exchange in 1753, and its construction absorbed many small closes that ran downhill across the breadth of the site, meaning that the chambers sat on top of the truncated buildings along those narrow streets. In their heyday, these alleyways were the haunt of Edinburgh's poorest and most diseased population. One of the grimmest was a dingy, overcrowded lane called Mary King's Close, which was particularly affected by an outbreak of bubonic plague in the year 1645. In a panic, the city fathers decided to quarantine the passageway, blocking it off at both ends, an early form of lockdown. The inhabitants were trapped, and all but a handful died. When the epidemic ended, the city's medics were ordered to open up the barricades and go in to take care of the putrefying corpses. They wore the protective clothing of the day, including the herb-filled beaks, which gave them their nickname of quacks. The medics elicited the help of the city butchers, who hurriedly hacked the victims into pieces, placed them in sacks, and they were then piled onto carts and taken to a mass grave outside the city limit in the area called the Meadows. Mary King's Close was sealed up again, and so it remained for some 40 years, a place people greatly feared. At night, ghostly noises were heard within the alley, and those brave enough to venture near the still sealed off area and squint through cracks in the wooden barrier reported seeing dismembered parts of human bodies coming towards them. 2 city ministers attempted to pacify the spirits by entering and conducting a cleansing exorcism. Within minutes, one was grabbed by a blood-covered arm, and the further sight of a human hand crawling up the cobbles towards them, they scarpered fast. Years passed, and by 1685, the city council was anxious to open up the Wynd again, as accommodation was badly needed in the overcrowded city. Just one couple applied to rent out 2 rooms, a lawyer named Thomas Coulthart and his wife. On their first night, Mrs. C was sitting up in bed reading the Bible when she looked up and saw a disembodied head float across the room. Thomas heard his wife scream, but dismissed it as his wife's overwrought imagination. Thomas went back to sleep, but was soon awakened by strange noises. Opening his eyes, it was not just the disembodied head he saw, it had been joined by a succession of severed limbs, and a young girl carrying her own head in her hands. The Coultharts bolted out of the building, and all attempts at renting out the street were given up. And the close remained empty until the top half was demolished, leaving the lower area as foundations for the city chambers above. For centuries, the close was ignored, either out of superstition or just forgotten in the passage of time. until it was discovered by council workmen in the 1970s. One city councillor offered to conduct groups into the close, accessed from the city chambers. The money he charged went to charity, so I took several school groups down there. Some of the doors still bore black crosses as warnings of the plague therein. And looking through windows, you could still see 17th century cooking utensils, bits of furniture, even scraps of old documents. And we did hear weird noises, some coming from a chimney breast, and we speculated, was it a 17th century child trying to escape the quarantine close? Other groups have reported seeing a young girl holding out her hands as if looking for a gift. She is still seen by those who now enter as part of a very commercialized enterprise. Many, knowing about the young girl, bring her gifts and they are left in the room where she is most frequently seen. Before it became big business and rather sanitized, a group of Edinburgh nurses were given permission to have a sponsored sleepover in the close. They received a fortune in sponsorship and so were duly taken down and left. The next morning, as they were let out, the council had expected them to be in states of shock, but they were mostly okay, just tired after a fairly sleepless night, caused partly out of fear, but mostly, they said, on account of the noisy party going on around them, the sound of singing and boisterous drinking. They were assured that the council chambers had no such revelry going on. There were no pubs within hearing distance. The noises they heard must have been from the 17th century, and that terrified them. A little further down the high street, this unusual carving rarely attracts the attention of anyone, locals or tourists alike, being as it is above head height at the entrance to Paisley Close. In 1861, many of Edinburgh's old tenements, including this one, were showing serious signs of their age. The one at Paisley Close had its 7 stories packed to the rafters with almost 80 people registered in the 1861 census. When a baker on the ground floor decided to enlarge his bread oven, the building was further weakened. And on the evening of Sunday, 24th November, 1861, it collapsed, killing 35 of its occupants. It took the rescuers 3 days to remove the rubble. And just as they were planning to finish searching, they heard a strange voice coming from the basement. "Heave awa, lads, I'm not dead yet." With some trepidation, in case it was the supernatural voice of a victim, the workers dug deeper and came across the still living body of a 12-year-old boy, Joseph McIver. When the tenement was rebuilt in 1867 and called Heave Awa House, it was decided to have a carving of the incident placed above the close. For some reason, the sculptor, maybe not a native Scot, chose to replace lads with chaps, hardly a word a 12-year-old Victorian Scot would use. So there it stands, 155 years later, barely noticed. And that face, often seen at a window, it is claimed to be a young girl, waving goodbye to her fiancé, and just as he turned back to acknowledge her, the building collapsed, killing her and 34 others. Let's complete our tour of Edinburgh at the World's End, the name given to the point where Edinburgh ended and the Netherbow port, and where the separate borough of Canongate began. To proud citizens of Scotland's capital, leaving the city meant they were leaving the world that mattered. Today, this pub marks the spot, but in 1686, the site was occupied by a mansion belonging to Sir James Stanfield, a successful cloth merchant. Unfortunately, he had an evil, reprobate son, Philip, a young man who often disgraced himself through his drunken behaviour. Whenever his father attempted to remonstrate, the boy would swear and curse at him. Sir James let it be known that he was going to write Philip out of his will, but before he could do so, Sir James's body was found drowned in Dunsappy Loch below Arthur Seat. His son gave a convincing appearance of being utterly distraught, claiming that his father had confessed to him that his business was going bankrupt. and that he could not stand the disgrace. Philip managed to convince a city magistrate that his father had committed suicide, and that, as no church would allow him to be buried in sacred ground, he would bury his father instead. The next day, suspicions had been awakened, and one of Sir James's closest friends convinced the authorities that the body should be exhumed and examined. At the post-mortem, the surgeons agreed that the body had not drowned. There was no water in the lungs. Instead, he had been hit on the head from behind. The friend of Sir James, a man with the marvellous name of Humphrey Spurway, suggested an old Scottish test be carried out. He had the body placed back into its coffin and ordered Philip to hold his father's head in both hands and declare his innocence of the murder. Ah! Immediately he did so. Blood poured from the corpse's head and from the fingernails of the son, who staggered back, asking for God's mercy. Stanfield's trial took place in February 1688. The judge, none other than Bloody Mackenzie, whom we met in Greyfriars Cemetery. The ordeal by touch was brought up as admissible evidence, and other information saw Mackenzie pronounce the death sentence. 2 weeks later, at the Market Cross, Stanfield was led out from the toll booth. His tongue, which had cursed his kindly parent, was cut off, as was the right hand, which had taken his father's life. During the hanging, the noose slipped, and the executioner had to step forward and manually strangle the suspended criminal. Stanfield's body was thereafter exhibited in a gibbet at the Gallows Lee between Edinburgh and Leith. And there is another strange twist to that tale. In October 1977, 2 girls, Christine Eady and Helen Scott, went missing. Sometime later, their naked and brutalised bodies were found in East Lothian, some 20 miles from Edinburgh. They had last been seen in the World's End pub, in the company of men. Some witnesses said 2, others thought that there were 3 of them, 2 seated and one a black bearded fellow standing behind them. A previously convicted rapist, Angus Sinclair, was accused of the murder but denied it, and in 1978, insufficient evidence could be found. In 2007, however, with better DNA technology, it was proven that Sinclair had indeed raped and murdered the girls. However, he always claimed that he had help. So who was the other man or men? Witnesses in the pub were interviewed and opinions varied. In addition to Sinclair, some described an older man, someone later identified indeed as Gordon Hamilton, Sinclair's brother-in-law. But others spoke of a tall, bearded person. Some described both. The nearest anyone came to identifying the bearded accomplice was this photo fit. Could it be an evil creature who had murdered his father and would not hesitate to return from the grave and encourage others to kill? The story was much more effective when I told it in the pub where my Edinburgh ghost tour ended. However, new owners were not keen on continuing the connection with the World's End murders, and they promptly renamed the pub Stanfield's. I pointed out the connection with that other murderer and his possible continuing presence in the building, and the pub was quickly changed back to the World's End. I was then asked to tell my story in the close next to the pub, a story made even better when an accomplice in an evil bearded mask rushed down the alley. I called my assistants jumpers out, usually 6-year students who love to put on a frightening mask, hide behind a wall or a tombstone and jump out at folk. But there were problems with that. Missed cues, costume failures, and snow. When a graveyard, such as this one in the Canongate, was covered in the white stuff, the members of my ghost group could clearly see footprints leading behind a nearby gravestone, and they were on their guard. There was a distinct lack of surprise when the ghost appeared. When the jumpers out were finished, they dashed for the train, and I collected their costumes, masks, and props in a suitcase. One dark winter evening, I was clearing up in the snow-covered cemetery when I spotted an old man leaning on a headstone and staring at another grave marker. I started to go over and see if he was all right when I noticed something. There were no prints in the snow leading to where he was sitting. My head, remember, was full of the tales I've been telling you tonight. I decided that discretion was the better part of valor. I grabbed my suitcase and departed very, very quickly. I hope that you have not been too frightened. I trust you've been entertained, perhaps even educated, and a very happy Halloween to you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That was brilliant.